Long before doctrine hardened into hierarchy, there existed a quieter stream of teaching that never depended on temples or permission. In one of the recovered luminous texts, attributed not to councils but to memory, a teacher known as Ishar spoke of a second form moving through the human frame. He didn't call it imagination or symbolism. He described it as structure, ordered, responsive, and real. Those closest to him, including Mara of the Coast and Elian the listener, were taught how to sense it, strengthen it, and eventually operate through
The veil is lifted.
This form was referred to
The
simply
heavens
as the
descend in
luminous
judgment.
vessel. Ishar explained
From the
that
eternal
this
light
vessel
I
was
call
not
forth
earned
the
through
ancient
morality
wisdom.
or granted by
receive
an
the
outside
Let it
power.
illuminate our path.
It arrived with you. It descended alongside your awareness when consciousness entered matter. Most people never noticed it because attention was trained elsewhere, toward weight, hunger, identity, and fear. But the vessel remained, layered through the flesh like light passing through glass, dormant yet intact. What unsettled the authorities of the age was not the poetry of this idea but its implication. According to these teachings, once the luminous vessel becomes active, consciousness no longer functions exclusively at the density of the physical world. Perception widens. Fear loses leverage. And most dangerously of all, the individual stops needing intermediaries. No gatekeepers. No ritual access points. No external absolution. When later institutions gathered fragments of these teachings to build a unified narrative, anything that allowed direct activation was quietly removed. Entire passages vanished. Names were altered. Instructions were reframed as allegory. The reason was simple. A person who knows how to operate beyond fear, beyond death anxiety, beyond social conditioning cannot be governed in the same way. The luminous vessel was said to function at a frequency beyond emotional manipulation. The ancient texts describe forces, called wardens rather than demons, that could only interact with slow, dense states of mind. Shame, panic, compulsive thought, rigid identity. These were their access points. The luminous vessel, once awake, shifted awareness outside that range. The wardens could observe behavior, but they could not reach the source. Most people were trained from birth to collapse their sense of self into the body alone. Pain meant danger. Pleasure meant truth. Survival became identity. In that contraction, the luminous vessel faded from awareness, not because it vanished, but because attention never touched it. The teachings emphasized that attention is the ignition switch. What you consistently notice becomes real to you. Ishar divided humanity into three experiential types, not as judgment but as description. Some lived entirely through material sensation. They felt real only when touched by the world. Others sensed something more but could not stabilize it, flashes of intuition, brief clarity, then collapse back into noise. And then there were those who carried a stable inner resonance, a quiet knowing that life was larger than the script handed to them. These were the ones the teachings were meant for. If you've ever felt a low-grade homesickness without an address, this is what the texts were pointing to. Not sadness. Not depression. A subtle memory of operating differently. A sense that this world is not wrong, just incomplete. That signal was described as the dormant vessel pressing gently against awareness, waiting to be acknowledged. The communities that preserved these teachings practiced activation as initiation. Not baptism, not vows, activation. When someone was ready, they were guided through recognition, breath, sound, and integration. The result wasn't belief. It was perception. People reported sensing layered reality, distinguishing between reactive emotion and clear awareness, and most importantly, losing their fear of physical death. Not through denial, but through continuity. This is where control fractured. A population that does not fear death cannot be threatened into obedience. A population that can directly perceive its own continuity does not outsource meaning. So the luminous vessel became heresy. Not because it contradicted faith, but because it bypassed authority. Centuries later, only fragments remained. A line here. A metaphor there. Enough to hint, not enough to activate. The instructions survived only in texts that were buried, mislabeled, or dismissed as myth. But the experience itself never disappeared. It continued to surface spontaneously, through near-death experiences, deep meditation, moments of crisis where identity collapses and something clearer steps forward. What the old texts insisted on, repeatedly, was that the luminous vessel does not activate through effort. It activates through recognition. You don't build it. You remember it. And once remembered, the relationship between you and reality changes. You still walk, work, speak, and sleep, but something fundamental has shifted behind the eyes. This is why the teachings were never mass distributed. Not everyone feels that inner resonance. And forcing activation without readiness leads only to confusion. But for those who do feel it, the recognition alone can feel like relief. Like exhaling after holding breath for decades, the suppression wasn't about protecting people from danger. It was about protecting systems from sovereignty. A person who knows they are more than a body cannot be reduced to a role. And that knowledge, once stabilized, cannot be taken away. The luminous vessel was never lost. It was simply ignored. And attention, once reclaimed, changes everything. As the organized structures grew more rigid, the language around inner experience became carefully managed. Teachings that once pointed inward were redirected outward. Authority replaced insight. Permission replaced perception. The luminous vessel was recast as metaphor, heaven postponed to a future event, and continuity reframed as something granted only after death. What had once been experiential became conditional. The old records describe a deliberate shift. Instead of guiding people to stabilize awareness beyond emotional reactivity, institutions taught them to distrust their own perception. Inner knowing was labeled temptation. Direct experience was dangerous. The message became clear: truth comes from outside you, and only through approved channels. This wasn't accidental drift. It was strategy. When the techniques of activation were removed, something else filled the space: rules, rituals, and narratives designed to keep attention anchored in fear and hope. Fear of punishment. Hope of reward. Both operate at the same dense frequency. Both keep awareness externally oriented. Neither allows sovereignty. The luminous vessel, by contrast, operates through clarity. When active, it allows a person to witness thoughts instead of being swallowed by them. Emotional surges still occur, but they pass through rather than define identity. This alone undermines most systems of control, which rely on predictable reactions. The ancient teachers understood something modern psychology is only beginning to articulate: attention determines reality. Whatever consistently holds your attention becomes the center of your experience. If your attention is trapped in survival narratives, your world shrinks. If your attention stabilizes in awareness itself, the world opens. This is why the activation process always began with recognition. Not belief. Recognition. A simple but radical acknowledgement: I am not limited to the sensations and stories of this body. That single shift loosens the grip of conditioning. The system loses traction. The institutions that rose afterward couldn't allow that. So recognition was replaced with confession. Breath with obedience. Sound with doctrine. Integration with identity labels. Each substitution kept people busy while preventing direct contact with the luminous layer of awareness, yet the texts insist the vessel cannot be destroyed. It can only be ignored. And ignoring something requires constant distraction. This is why noise became sacred. Endless activity. Endless moral anxiety. Endless comparison. Anything to keep attention outward and fragmented. Those who accidentally brushed against the luminous state, through solitude, crisis, or deep contemplation, were often labeled unstable or dangerous. Their clarity didn't fit the model. They spoke calmly about death. They didn't respond to threats as expected. They couldn't be easily categorized. What frightened authorities most was not rebellion but indifference. A person operating from the luminous vessel still participates in the world, but without desperation. They work, but aren't defined by status. They care, but aren't owned by fear. That subtle freedom is contagious. So the suppression continued, not just through censorship but through education. Children were trained early to equate self with performance, worth with approval, identity with role. By the time the luminous signal stirred, most people had learned to dismiss it as fantasy. Still, some couldn't ignore it. They felt the quiet pressure of something more stable than thought. A background awareness that didn't fluctuate with mood. They didn't have language for it, but they recognized it when they encountered fragments of the old teachings. Something in them responded before logic engaged. This is how the knowledge survived. Not through institutions, but through resonance. The texts describe the wardens, forces that govern reactive consciousness, not as villains but as functionaries. They manage the material layer. They cannot perceive beyond it. When awareness shifts frequency, it simply falls outside their jurisdiction. There is no battle. No resistance. Just irrelevance. That's the part that was never taught publicly. Freedom doesn't come from overthrowing systems. It comes from no longer needing them to define reality. The luminous vessel doesn't reject the physical world. It integrates it. You still feel sensation. You still navigate emotion. But you are no longer collapsed into them. Awareness gains depth. Perspective becomes vertical instead of horizontal. This is why the old initiations emphasized stability. Activation without integration leads to imbalance. But when integration is present, the individual becomes quietly ungovernable, not rebellious, just clear, and clarity is difficult to manage. The suppression worked for centuries because it trained people to seek meaning elsewhere. But the signal never stopped transmitting. It simply waited for attention. And attention, once turned inward with sincerity, completes what was interrupted. What remains is not belief, but access. The final fragments that survived weren't philosophical at all. They were practical. Quiet instructions passed from voice to voice, always framed the same way. This is not something you imagine into being. This is something you notice, then allow. The luminous vessel responds to clarity, not effort. The activation sequence was never dramatic. No altered costumes. No initiations under authority. It unfolded in stages because awareness itself unfolds in stages. Skip one, and the experience collapses back into concept. The first stage was always recognition. Not affirmation. Recognition. Sitting still long enough to admit, without drama, that awareness exists prior to sensation. That the sense of, I am, remains even when thoughts slow. This recognition alone creates a fracture in material identification. Something loosens. Space appears. Once recognition stabilizes, breath becomes the bridge. The texts describe breath not as oxygen intake, but as a directional movement of attention. Inhaling while allowing awareness to descend through the center of the body. Exhaling while allowing awareness to expand beyond the skin. Not visualizing forcefully, allowing gently. Breath gives shape to attention. Attention gives shape to experience. After several cycles, most people report the same thing, a subtle perimeter. Warmth. Pressure. A sense of presence that does not belong to muscle or bone. That perimeter is not created, it's revealed. It has always been there, ignored, then comes sound. Spoken declaration was used not to convince reality, but to anchor awareness. Sound organizes attention. When spoken clearly, without emotion or pleading, it stabilizes the shift. The phrases varied across regions, but the meaning was identical, awareness acknowledging itself as embodied light. At this point, nothing mystical happens outwardly. No visions required. No fireworks. The change is internal but structural. Awareness no longer collapses fully into thought. There is space between stimulus and response. That space is the luminous vessel functioning. The final stage was integration. This is where many modern seekers fail, not because it's difficult, but because it's subtle. Integration means holding awareness of both layers at once. Feeling the weight of the body while simultaneously sensing the expanded perimeter. Not escaping the physical. Including it. When integration stabilizes, the effects are unmistakable, though rarely dramatic. Emotional triggers lose intensity. Fear-based thoughts feel external, like weather passing through rather than commands to obey. Dreams become vivid and coherent. Intuition sharpens, not as prophecy, but as pattern recognition. The old texts list signs, not as promises, but as confirmations. Increased clarity in chaotic environments. Reduced attachment to outcome. A sense of continuity that removes urgency from life decisions. People often notice that others respond differently to them, calmer, more open, without knowing why. Most importantly, the fear of cessation dissolves. Not through belief in afterlife narratives, but through experiential continuity. Awareness recognizes itself as not bound to sensation. Death anxiety loses leverage. And with it, manipulation loses its primary tool. This is why repetition was emphasized. Not to strengthen the vessel, it's already intact, but to stabilize attention. 7 cycles were common, not for superstition, but for rhythm. By the end, awareness rests naturally in both layers without effort. Nothing about this removes you from the world. You still work. You still care. You still feel. But you no longer mistake fluctuation for identity. You operate from depth instead of reaction. The luminous vessel does not make you special. It makes you stable, and stability is the quietest form of freedom. Before we close, pause for a moment and notice something simple. You followed this all the way through. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition. That alone says more than labels ever could. If this perspective clarified something you felt but never named, consider subscribing, not for answers, but for continued exploration. If this shifted how you see control, awareness, or identity, tap like so others who feel that same signal can find it. And if you know someone who's been quietly questioning the structure beneath things, share this with them. Not to convince, just to offer resonance.